So let me quickly check the sound. Need to make sure everything's working. Okay, that looks good. I have to set the gain of the microphone a little bit lower. Okay. Well, this time I'm doing a live coding session. Live streaming was disabled last evening, so I had to record my coding session. Tonight I just want to give a quick update on the state of the vendor base I have implemented last night. I tried to reduce some. Oh, first things first. What we forgot last night was the most important part actually. We didn't test for the inheritance. So we have created the interface for the vendor base, which provides access to environment variables. And what we did not do was we did not check the inheritance. And I've added this one and already committed. Actually, in the code, I have forgotten this one too. Let's have a look at it. This is the vendor base. This is the base class that gives the contract with the application programming interface. And in the concrete implementation of the vendor base object class, we're now extending the vendor base. And we added the test here in the test class, and make sure that the object is an instance of and vendor base. So while I was implementing the environment class, which is a singleton that gets configured with the vendor base by using ExtJS config system, I often face the problem that I want to have a class property immutable. For instance, once the vendor base is set, I do not want to allow the developer to change it during the runtime. So whatever reason there would be to change a vendor base during the runtime, it's simply not allowed, and I want to make sure that the developer understands it by throwing an exception, and at least documenting that an exception will be thrown if the property was already set. Additionally, the vendor base is must be an instance of the class we have implemented as the base class, which is in Coon Core and vendor base. So if any check fails, like for example, if the vendor base is not undefined, we're gonna throw an unsupported operation exception. And if the vendor base was not yet set, and it's not an instance of Coon Core and vendor base, we want to throw an illegal argument exception. So this environment class, which is a singleton, is already implemented. But we're missing two more classes: the illegal argument exception and unsupported operation exception. And actually, what I did in the past when I was implementing an immutable class property, I simply made a call to XRaise, which would trigger an error, a native JavaScript error, and throw this one. But I don't want to rely on XRaise and instead throw custom exceptions, because the use case or the cases in which I have to check for an immutable class instance property, and if it's being changed, they're quite often. They appear quite often in my code. And so I decided to create those exception classes. The thing is, that, hold on, give me a second. Okay, the thing is that while I was fiddling around with implementing the exception classes, I thought it would be a good idea to check the current state of XJS and if it is maybe possible to create a module out of a class, of an exception class, and simply import it in the exception classes that inherit from this exception. So for example, we have the exception base class from which every exception should inherit, and that is Core exception. And then we have, for instance, the illegal argument exception, which is an exception and therefore has to extend Core exception. So what I tried was, I did try to use ECMA6 class system, like I could quickly give an example. This one here, class exception extends error. So that was basically this what I wanted to do, is to create an exception class that extends from the native JavaScript error object, or JavaScript native error class. But in order to make it available to the illegal argument exception, I had to go ahead and import exception from exception.js. So I would be able to export this one. Damn it. As a module. But the thing is, if you're working with modules and exports and imports, you have to declare the scripts which are loaded. They have their type attribute, and it must not be text JavaScript, but it has to be module. And while that shouldn't pose a big deal in development environment, because as you can see, let me see if it's still open, the bootstrap file is here it is. Okay, it creates all the script tags and makes sure the scripts get loaded into the page. But what happens here is the element type is set to text JavaScript, and for the most scripts you could use the type module. But the problem is then need to provide some kind of a source map to differentiate between a JavaScript file that holds a module and a JavaScript file that simply holds an ExtJS class. So at this point, things began to become a little bit more complicated because the build process itself, if you run a production build, if you run a production build, the same thing must be done. You have to mix and match probably ExtJS classes and modules, and the best thing would be to rewrite everything. But I guess that is a lot of work that has to be done, and actually it's without going very deep in the without touching the core of ExtJS, it's impossible. And then you start to fork the project, the ExtJS project. You might revert to the GPL version of the ExtJS project and work on module and ECMA6 class support there. But you're missing out on all the features that were added in between. And you're probably locked with the GPL version of ExtJS. So I'm not sure if that is such a good idea. And if anyone thinks that is a good idea, please let me know. So we might be able to find a way to work around this one. What I did was also I told myself I will never create exception classes anymore, because I want to rely on the native error support the languages provide. I decided to give this one another shot, just for the two exceptions: illegal argument exception and unsupported operation exception. And what I want to do from now on, while I'm implementing those new classes, is I want to use more of the ECMA6 features and syntax to make sure that a later refactoring of those class definitions poses not so much work if I want to do that. So I started with using the shorthand syntax for class methods, and I started to omit simple data types as class properties. I also made sure that property which must be immutable is locked or made immutable by using Object.freeze. Changing the message property, which holds the exception message for an exception class. If some user or some developer, that is, goes into the code and wants to create an exception class. Hold on. I have to put my mic a little bit more down so I can see my keyboard. If a developer wants to change the message property of the exception class by calling next create coon call exception, and I usually use X, and he supplies the message for the constructor. he is able to call xmsg another string. That is, it won't give an error because we cannot run ExtJS in the current state of ExtJS. We cannot run it in strict mode. So we need to, yeah, well, that would throw an exception in an error that would throw an error in strict mode, but it doesn't throw an error. Currently, it just silently ignores that the developer tries to override the property with another value. And what happens here is that will equal to exception thrown. So JavaScript discarded this command, or did not discard it, but it just ignored it, and it didn't throw an error because it's not running in strict mode. And I don't think that it's necessary to provide an extra setter for the message property for, throwing an exception that the property of an exception is not allowed to be mutated. And this is the reason why I simply froze the object with all its properties, or at least with the message property. And of course, you have to provide kind of documentation that the MSG property is immutable. But in the end, well, I think it's the code is more clean and it doesn't get cluttered with so much information about properties that are not allowed to be changed. So in this case, I think it's okay to change to make the property accessible. And if the developer for some reason wants to change the property, simply cannot change it because it's frozen. So all we have right now with ExtJS is a solid framework for component-based JavaScript library, UI component-based library. And the rest is pretty much lacking. You don't have support for ECMA 6, or you don't have a lot of support for the cool features of ECMA 6. But you can still, work your way around it. And in the end, what you're doing is you're implementing some kind of business logic in your application. And that's what you also would do if you could all do the scaffolding with ECMA 6 language features. So it's definitely a drawback because ExtJS does not deserve the noun modern, but hope's not lost yet. Or maybe they are able to provide some kind of support for it. I'm not so sure about it because so much time has passed right now for the framework and I haven't seen anything on the road. Providing the tests for the exception classes to make sure that they are available for the environment manager. And for this one, I will implement the interface, the API for the unsupported operation exception. Since we do not provide much logic in the exception classes, the test cases will most likely just hold the type check to see if the unsupported operation exception and the illegal argument exception extend exception. And we have the test case for the exception already implemented. And we're testing for changing the message property, which is frozen. That's a good thing. And that is enough for this test. Simply checking if the instance of we have created from the illegal argument exception is of type core exception. We simply copy paste it. So we have this one complete. This one to the harness right here. Then fire up our development version of libcn core. Reload it to make sure that the unsupported operation exception is available, and it's not because I did not provide the proper name. There we go. Something is not working. Let's see, what's the issue here? This looks good. The classes here. The test case looks good. Let's see if it creates the exception class. It does not. Let's see what's going wrong here. It's probably running into the loader to load the class. So it's probably undefined. And now it goes to sync require. To synchronously load the class. I have the feeling that it's related to the Object.freeze. Let's have a look at it. Good morning. Right, that was the issue. Of course, I did not provide a config object. Let's see how we can make this work. Okay, we're not providing an object. In that case, we have to fall back to an empty object. or type of object else undefined. So that would be probably better. We do type check for object instead of simply accessing some kind of data type. We have no idea what lands in the constructor in the end. We could also do the following and allow for type of CFG string, then use CFG. Let's go to undefined. Okay. Yes, you can do that. So now I should be able to run the test in two different ways. Okay, we're checking for immutable. We're checking for undefined. Expect next MSG to be undefined. And we're checking for a string. This works as expected. All right, now we want to make sure that this one is not using the debugger statement. We check for the instance of and the unsupported operation exception. Okay, and that's a wrap. That means that we can go ahead and commit the changes. This one will be added along with the exception classes. And we have changed the index. Oh, hold on. First things first. we will add the vendor base. One more thing I've changed is I changed the object in which the key will be looked up in the vendor base. I've changed this to the return value of this get environment to make clear that we're working on the environment that is contracted by as a return value by this method. So I'm making sure we're not working with X-manifest in all the methods, but make sure that the return value of get environment is used, because that might change due to some reason in the future. So we do not have the X-manifest hard-coded in there. Okay, vendor base test, vendor base test. That is. And we will be committing the exception classes. Can revert util. Looking good. All right, that's it for now. I hope you have a good night and still enjoy coding on the weekend. Don't forget to grab some coffee. Bye bye.